There is a moment after every big win when a locker room tells you everything you need to know about a coaching staff. Not the press conference, not the post-game interviews, the locker room, that raw, unfiltered space where a head coach stands in front of her players and communicates, without any media filter, what she actually values and who she actually sees. After Caitlin Clark delivered one of the most historically significant individual performances in the documented history of women's professional basketball, Stephanie White stood in that locker room and did not say her name, not once. And before anyone rushes to frame that as a minor detail, an oversight born from the heat of the moment, or just a coach's stylistic preference for collective praise over individual recognition, let's be completely clear about what Clark had just done on that floor and why the silence that followed it is not minor at all. This is the story of a pattern, and patterns don't lie. Caitlin Clark walked off that court against the Chicago Sky having just produced 32 points, 10 assists, and 7 rebounds. She had gone 11 for 11 from the free throw line across the most pressure-filled execution stretches of a game that pushed all the way to overtime. 11 consecutive makes. Not a single miss. In a game where every point mattered and every possession carried weight, she was perfect from the line every single time Indiana needed her to be. But the number that sits above all the others, the one that rewrites a page in the record books permanently, is the one that involves her teammate, Aaliyah Boston. Clark and Boston became the first pair of teammates in WNBA history to each record a 30-point double-double in the same game. Read that again and let it settle. The first time ever in the entire documented history of women's professional basketball. Not the first time this season, not the first time in recent memory, the first time in the history of this league that two players on the same team reached that threshold in the same game. That is the kind of milestone that gets engraved into the permanent record of a sport, the kind of achievement that a head coach, standing in a locker room full of players who just witnessed it firsthand, would naturally, instinctively, and enthusiastically want to acknowledge. Stephanie White acknowledged Aaliyah Boston's career-high 34 points and 12 rebounds. She deserved every word of that recognition. Boston was outstanding. But Clark's 32? Clark's 10 assists? Clark's 7 rebounds? Clark's 11 consecutive free throws? Clark's role in producing that historic first alongside Boston? None of it. Not a reference, not a passing mention, not even a gesture in her direction. The name Caitlin Clark did not leave Stephanie White's mouth in that locker room following the most historically significant teammate performance this league has ever seen. Here is exactly what White said, word for word. "Really good job, okay? Really good job. We weathered the storms, okay? We came together, y'all. I heard you more in huddles and in timeouts than I've heard you all year long. And that matters. That matters, right? The collective positivity, the collective accountability, talking each other up. That is huge, y'all. We are closing that fist right here. But I'm so proud of the way that you came together, the way that you fought in that fourth quarter and those runs, the way that we came together going into overtime and finishing this game. We grew today. I'm proud of you guys." AB career-high 34 points. We had 29 points off of turnovers. We outscored them 58-48 in the paint, 19 second chance points. A lot of really good stuff. And most importantly, we grew today. That's it. That is the complete address. AB gets her name, her career high gets announced to the room, the paint scoring gets highlighted, the second chance points get applause, and the player who just produced a 32-point double-double and joined Boston in making WNBA history stands in that room and hears nothing directed at her. No name, no number, not even a gesture in her direction. The name Caitlin Clark did not leave Stephanie White's mouth in that locker room following the most historically significant teammate performance this league has ever seen. Here is exactly what White said in front of the cameras. And it wasn't just about what she didn't say regarding Clark, it was about what she did say regarding Kelsey Mitchell. White described Mitchell's night as a quiet, productive one, a quiet 19, said with warmth, said with appreciation, said at the same podium from which zero acknowledgement of Clark's 32-point historic double-double had come. Now here is why that specific characterization demands examination. It demands it not because Mitchell doesn't deserve recognition for her scoring output, but because of what happened in the final minute of regulation that the word quiet conveniently glosses over. Indiana was leading by 5 points with approximately 1 minute left in regulation. 5 points against a Chicago Sky team sitting at 4 wins and 8 losses. That lead, in that moment, against that opponent, should have been a closed door. The correct execution, the only correct execution, was simple. Control possession, bleed the clock, force Chicago to foul if they wanted a chance. Instead, Mitchell drove into a contested layup attempt and missed. The lead dropped to 3. The clock was not managed. Chicago got the ball back with time restored, and momentum shifted to a place they had absolutely no business occupying, given what Indiana's lead had been 30 seconds earlier. On the very next possession, the Indiana coaching staff called an inbound play. Caitlin Clark was standing on that floor, having just gone 11 for 11 from the free throw line, 11 consecutive makes. She was the most statistically reliable execution option in that building at that specific moment. The inbound play was designed to go to Mitchell. The ball came off Mitchell's leg and went out of bounds. Skylar Diggins caught the subsequent possession and hit a three-pointer. Overtime. That is the specific sequence of events that Stephanie White described as Mitchell having had a quiet, productive night. That is the competitive reality that the word quiet was asked to cover. And standing right next to all of that, on the same floor, in the same game, was Clark's 32-point historic double-double that won Indiana the game in overtime, despite the sequence that made overtime necessary in the first place. One player's decisions contributed to a 5-point lead evaporating into overtime. That player got prominent podium recognition. The player whose extraordinary individual performance was the actual reason Indiana won both games received nothing in the locker room and minimal engagement at the press conference. That contrast is not subtle, and it did not happen in isolation. 2 weeks before this game, Indiana nearly surrendered a 17-point lead to the Washington Mystics. A 17-point lead against a team that had no business being in that game. The lead eroded, the situation became genuinely dangerous, and then Caitlin Clark hit a deep-range game-winning shot that closed the door before Indiana could complete what would have been one of the most embarrassing collapses of the season. Post-game, credit distribution from White leaned prominently toward other contributors in ways that consistently minimized Clark's central and decisive role in saving that game. 2 games, 2 separate occasions where Clark's individual excellence rescued Indiana from a competitive situation that the surrounding coaching and execution decisions had helped create. 2 post-game communication sequences that failed to center the player whose performance was the definitive reason Indiana walked out of both buildings with wins. At a certain point, a recurring outcome across unrelated games stops being a stylistic preference and starts being a pattern. And this is a pattern. It has the same structure, the same result, and the same communication fingerprint across multiple games, against multiple opponents in multiple situations. Patterns in organizational behavior are not random. They reflect something about the priorities of the people producing them. They reflect what a coaching staff sees, what it values, and what it chooses to emphasize when it controls the narrative in the spaces where narrative is built. The locker room is one of those spaces. The podium is another. And across both of those spaces, the pattern has been remarkably consistent. Clark produces, Clark rescues, Clark makes history, and the acknowledgement goes elsewhere. But to fully understand what this pattern means, you have to place it inside the broader organizational context that this Indiana Fever season has been building throughout its entire run. Because the locker room silence after the Chicago Sky game is not the first piece of this picture. It is the most recent documented entry in a file that has been accumulating evidence for months. Earlier this season, journalist Scott Agnes had his credentials revoked. The reason? Documented and publicly discussed, connected to his reporting on the Fever. Accurate journalism about this team produced a credential consequence. That is a specific and serious organizational choice that communicates something about how this front office responds to coverage it finds uncomfortable. Then there was the situation surrounding Sophie Cunningham, following an Instagram post that connected to the broader social media environment around Clark. The implied consequences around Cunningham's deployment following that situation were noted, discussed, and analyzed by people paying close attention to how this organization manages its internal dynamics when external pressures intersect with the Clark story. And then there is what may be the most damaging of all the organizational failures this season. During the weeks when the anti-Clark character campaign was at its most active online, when coordinated criticism and targeted narratives were being pushed across social media platforms with a consistency and intensity that went beyond normal fan discourse, the Indiana Fever organization was largely silent. Not privately silent, publicly silent. The franchise did not step forward in any meaningful or visible way to defend the player who is, by every commercial and competitive measure, the most important person in their organization. They watched, and they said nothing. Now place that organizational silence next to the locker room silence after a 32-point double-double and a historic WNBA first. Place it next to the credential consequence for accurate journalism. Place it next to the implied deployment consequences following the Instagram situation. Place it next to the post-game communication pattern that twice in consecutive games failed to acknowledge the player who won the game. The picture that emerges when you put all of those pieces together in the same frame is not ambiguous. It is a specific and coherent organizational portrait. And what it portrays is a coaching and front office environment that is not operating in alignment with the competitive and commercial interests of the most important player in women's professional basketball. There is a concept in organizational culture research that is simple but consequential. What gets acknowledged gets repeated. What gets ignored is treated as baseline. When a head coach stands in a locker room after a win and names the contributors who made it happen, she is doing something more than expressing gratitude. She is communicating to every player in that room what the organization considers worthy of recognition. She is establishing what the standard looks like and who the standard bearers are. She is building the culture of that locker room, one acknowledgement at a time. When Clark's 32-point historic double-double is absent from that acknowledgement, what gets communicated to the room is that what Clark did is expected. Not extraordinary, not worthy of explicit celebration, just what Clark does. Baseline. And here is why that specific communication choice carries consequences that extend far beyond one post-game speech. When the most exceptional individual in your organization is consistently treated as baseline, when her extraordinary achievements are acknowledged less prominently than the contributions of players whose decisions helped create competitive difficulty, something happens to the culture of that environment. It shifts. It calibrates around the wrong center, and the player producing the most exceptional outcomes begins operating in an organizational environment that is not structured to support, amplify, or maximize what she is capable of delivering. Clark is producing historic performances right now. Historic. Not impressive for a second-year player, not encouraging for a rebuilding franchise. Historically significant in the documented record of this sport. And she is doing it inside an organizational coaching environment that didn't say her name after the most individually exceptional performance of this WNBA season. The word for what that combination produces is not sustainable. You cannot consistently extract historic performances from a player while simultaneously building a coaching culture that treats those performances as invisible. At some point, the gap between what is being produced and what is being acknowledged becomes its own competitive problem. Not because Clark will stop competing. She has demonstrated beyond any reasonable analytical doubt that she will compete regardless of the environment surrounding her, but because the organizational environment that treats her contributions as baseline is also the organizational environment making in-game decisions that send inbound plays to the wrong player when the right player is standing there having gone 11 for 11 from the line. The communication choices and the in-game design choices come from the same place. They express the same organizational priority. And that priority is costing Indiana Fever wins and costing Caitlin Clark the acknowledgement she has earned. Let's talk specifically about what Clark deserved after this game. Not in the abstract, not as a philosophical point of fairness or recognition. Specifically, concretely, in direct proportion to what she actually produced. She deserved her name in that locker room address for 32 points in a game that required individual heroics because the late-game decision-making surrounding her created an overtime situation that a 5-point lead with 1 minute remaining should never have become. She deserved it for 10 assists, a number that would have been 15 or more if the players on the receiving end of her passes had converted at professional rates. She deserved it for 7 rebounds from the point guard position in a game that went into overtime and demanded extended physical engagement. She deserved it for 11 consecutive free throws in the game's most critical execution stretches. Perfect. Every single time Indiana needed her to be. She deserved it for the historic 30-point double-double partnership with Aaliyah Boston that had never, in any game played in this league before this one, been accomplished by 2 teammates. First in history, achieved on Indiana's floor, with Clark as one of the 2 players who made it happen. She received none of it in the locker room, and at the podium, the quiet, productive night framing was reserved for the player whose decisions helped send a controlled game into overtime. That communication is now documented. It is part of the permanent record. It cannot be walked back, softened, or reframed by any subsequent organizational narrative management. It happened. It was captured, and it will be evaluated in the full context of everything else this season has placed into the evidence file. The central question that this entire documented pattern forces into the open is the one that every person with a genuine stake in Indiana Fever basketball needs to sit with seriously, not emotionally, not reactively, seriously and analytically. Can this team maximize what Caitlin Clark is capable of producing under a coaching staff whose communication in the locker room and at the podium consistently fails to acknowledge what she actually produces? Can a franchise extract the full competitive and commercial value of its most important player from inside an organizational environment where that player's historic performances are treated as invisible in the most direct and natural recognition settings available to a coaching staff? Can the culture that White is building in that locker room, the one where 32-point double-doubles go unnamed while quiet, productive nights get highlighted, support the kind of sustained excellence that a Clark-centered championship contender requires? The evidence of this season, game by game, speech by speech, decision by decision, has been answering those questions with increasing specificity. Caitlin is winning games despite this environment. She is producing historic performances despite this environment. She is dragging Indiana to victories from inside competitive situations that the coaching decisions surrounding her have helped create. And she is doing all of it without the organizational support, the explicit acknowledgement, or the in-game design alignment that a player of her caliber, operating at her level, deserves from the people whose professional responsibility is to maximize her. That is the complete picture. Not a rumor, not a speculative narrative assembled from ambiguous data, a documented, specific, analytically coherent picture assembled from locker room footage, post-game press conference transcripts, in-game decision sequences, and the full organizational context that this season has been producing as evidence since its opening weeks. Stephanie White needed Caitlin Clark to win that game. Clark delivered 32 points, 10 assists, 7 rebounds, 11 perfect free throws, and a place in the WNBA record books. White stepped to the podium and called Kelsey Mitchell's night a quiet, productive one. She stepped away from the locker room, having said every name that mattered in that room except the one that mattered most. The locker room is where coaches build culture. It is where they establish what the organization values. It is where players learn in the clearest possible terms what they need to produce to be seen, recognized, and affirmed by the people leading them. What White built in that locker room following the Chicago Sky game communicated something exact and specific about what this organization values. And what it communicated is not what a team built around Caitlin Clark should be communicating to itself, to its players, and to the most exceptional individual in women's professional basketball after she delivers the kind of performance that does not get produced twice in a generation. The silence said everything, and now everyone has heard it. That silence belongs permanently to Stephanie White's coaching record at the Indiana Fever. It sits alongside every inbound play called away from the open shooter, every post-game credit sequence that redirected recognition from the player who produced the result, every organizational communication failure that left Clark standing in spaces where her name should have been the first one spoken. The evidence file is detailed, it is specific, and it continues to grow with every game that passes. History remembered what Clark did against the Chicago Sky. The only question left is whether the organization responsible for building around her will.